On the morning of January 30th, 2004, a 77-year-old retired professor named Laura Lee Crane drove to her local grocery store in Fort Worth, Texas. It was a Friday, her regular shopping day. She was still sitting in her car in the parking lot when a man walked up, opened her driver's side door, looked at her, and said 2 words. "Slide over." She did. That was the last moment of Laura Lee Crane's life as she knew it. What followed over the next 36 to 48 hours was something that still makes investigators pause when they talk about it. She was driven around Fort Worth by 2 people high on crack cocaine, robbed of her credit cards and her money, had 23 feet of duct tape wrapped around her entire face, covering her mouth, her nose, everything, and was locked in the trunk of her own car, where she suffocated to death somewhere on the road between Texas and Oklahoma. She had spent her entire career helping children with learning disabilities find their voice. The man who put her in that trunk was named Edward Lee Busby Jr. On May 14, 2026, 22 years later, the state of Texas executed him by lethal injection. He became the 600th person executed in Texas since the state resumed the death penalty in 1982. This is the full story of what happened, who Laura Lee Crane was, who Edward Busby was, and one of the most contested executions Texas has carried out in years. Edward Lee Busby Jr. has just been executed by lethal injection for the crime he committed in 2004, when he was 31 years old. The kidnapping, robbery, and suffocation murder of 77-year-old retired Professor Laura Lee Crane in Fort Worth, Texas on January 30, 2004. Busby grew up in poverty in the Fort Worth area. His childhood was marked by instability, deprivation, and almost no educational foundation. By the time he was an adult, he had a history of drug addiction, crack cocaine specifically, that had consumed his life and driven every bad decision he had ever made. Prosecutors described him at trial as a thief, a pimp, and a drug dealer. His defense attorneys described him as a man with a low IQ, chronic learning disabilities, and a lifetime of addiction that left him functioning well below the level of a typical adult. His IQ scores, tested multiple times across his life and his time in prison, consistently fell between 65 and 75. To put that in context, an IQ of 70 is the general clinical threshold for intellectual disability. Busby hovered right around and below that line across every single test ever administered to him. By the summer of 2003, Busby had no stable home, no income, and no plan. He was living at a motel at Lancaster and Riverside in Fort Worth, surviving day to day, consumed by his addiction to crack cocaine. He was 30 years old then, and it was at the motel he met a woman called Kathleen Latimer. Kathleen Latimer, known to people around her as Kitty, was 39 years old when she met Edward Busby in the summer of 2003. She described the moment they met in a jailhouse interview years later. She was standing in the doorway of her motel room one day when a truck pulled up. Busby, who she called JB, stepped out, talking and laughing with the men she described as the dope boys, who came around the motel. He saw her standing there, asked the others who she was, walked over, and introduced himself. She let him in. They started getting high on crack cocaine together. And that, essentially, was the beginning of their relationship. Not romance in any meaningful sense, just 2 people bound together by addiction, living in a motel room, going nowhere fast. By the time January 2004 arrived, they had barely slept in almost 2 weeks. They had been high on crack cocaine for most of that time. Kathleen owed someone money for drugs. They needed to get out of Fort Worth fast, and they needed a car to do it. On the morning of January 30th, 2004, they left the motel and made their way toward the Tom Thumb grocery store at the corner of Hullen and Bel Air, a busy shopping center in a quiet, upscale part of southwestern Fort Worth. A man who worked at the clothing store next door later told investigators he had seen them coming. A very blonde woman walking fast, trying to catch up with a man about 30 yards ahead of her who was already moving through the parking lot, trying car door handles as he went. At 11:15 in the morning, Laura Lee Crane pulled into that parking lot in her car. Friday was her regular shopping day. She hadn't made it out of the car yet when Busby approached, opened her driver's side door, and said, "Slide over." She did. Busby got behind the wheel. Kathleen got in the back seat. And they drove away from that grocery store parking lot with a 77-year-old woman sitting in the front seat of her own car, taken completely by surprise on an ordinary Friday morning. Now here is the detail that stops you cold. According to the account Kathleen gave in her jailhouse interview, at some point during that first stretch of the abduction, they stopped at a store. And Kathleen went inside. And she bought two things, duct tape and 2 scratch-off lottery tickets. At some point, they wrapped Laura Crane's head with the duct tape. Not her hands. Not her feet. Her head. Completely. Her mouth. Her nose. 23 feet of it, wrapped around her entire face. And then they put her in the trunk of her own car. Busby later said in a jailhouse interview, weeping as he spoke, that he had made a gap in the tape so she could breathe. He said he planned to release her when they got to Oklahoma. He said he wanted to find a fresh start in Oklahoma, away from the addiction and the trouble in Fort Worth. He said he never intended for her to die. Here is what we know happened in that trunk. Laura Lee Crane, a 77-year-old woman who had dedicated her entire life to helping children with learning difficulties find their way in the world, prayed. According to Busby himself, he spoke with her during the ordeal. He prayed with her multiple times. And she, this woman in the trunk of her car with duct tape over her face, told him that God would forgive him. Meanwhile, Busby and Kathleen drove. They used Laura Crane's credit cards and a blank check to steal more than $775. They checked into a motel room. They went looking for crack cocaine in the area. Busby asked the motel clerk where the hood was. Hood means where they can buy crack cocaine, but they didn't find any. And then a police officer pulled them over for a traffic violation. Kathleen later said that when she looked up and saw the officer at the window, she said, "Just get me out of the car." She was arrested on the spot. And Busby drove away with Laura Lee Crane still in the trunk. He was arrested in Oklahoma City, driving Crane's car. When authorities picked him up, he confessed. He led them to Laura Crane's body, which was found wrapped in a motel sheet at the bottom of an embankment off Interstate 35 near Davis, Oklahoma, just north of the Texas state line. The autopsy confirmed that Laura Lee Crane died from asphyxiation. The duct tape had sealed off her airway. She had suffocated in the trunk of her own car, somewhere on the road between Texas and Oklahoma. The woman he killed, Laura Lee Grogan Crane, was born on July 13, 1926, in Fort Worth, Texas. She grew up there, graduated from Pascal High School, and went on to earn a Bachelor of Fine Arts degree from Sweetbriar College in Virginia, and later a Master of Arts from Texas Christian University, the same institution where she would spend the defining decades of her professional life. Her entire career was devoted to one purpose: helping children with learning disabilities. At a time when learning disabilities were poorly understood, barely recognized, and often dismissed, when children who struggled to read or process information were simply labeled slow, difficult, or unteachable, Laura Lee Crane was among the people working to change that. She helped found the Starpoint School at TCU, a facility specifically designed to serve children with learning differences. She served as its director for more than 20 years. She didn't just run the school. She trained the teachers. She developed a nationally recognized reading program for students with learning disabilities that was used far beyond the walls of Starpoint. She counseled parents. She gave struggling children tools they could carry with them for the rest of their lives. Former students of hers wrote tributes after her death describing how she had changed the direction of their careers, their lives, their understanding of what they were capable of. She was a remarkable person. She had the ability to analyze the needs of every child and figure out what worked for each child. No matter what, she put children first. Now here is the detail about this case that is genuinely difficult to sit with. Laura Lee Crane spent her life helping people with learning disabilities and intellectual limitations. The man who killed her, Edward Lee Busby Jr., was himself intellectually disabled. His IQ scores had fallen consistently below or right at the threshold for intellectual disability every single time he was tested. The woman he put in that trunk was one of the foremost educators in the country for people with minds like his. She was 77 years old, a widow after 55 years of marriage. On Friday, January 30th, 2004, her regular shopping day, she drove to the grocery store near her home. Her family spent the next 22 years watching the case move through the courts. Both Edward Busby and Kathleen Latimer were charged with capital murder and kidnapping. At trial, prosecutors Greg Miller and Joe Shannon built their case around Busby's confession, the physical evidence from the crime scene, the duct tape forensics, and the autopsy confirming asphyxiation. Investigators also recovered Laura Crane's credit card records and the blank check, a paper trail of the hours she spent in that trunk while Busby and Kathleen used her money. Busby's defense attorneys Jack Strickland and Steve Gordon argued that Busby's intellectual limitations, his chronic drug addiction, his poverty-stricken upbringing, and his learning disabilities meant his sentence should be life rather than death. They did not dispute his involvement in the crime. They argued about what he deserved for it. The jury was not persuaded. On November 17, 2005, a Tarrant County jury found Edward Lee Busby Jr. guilty of capital murder. The verdict carried an automatic death sentence. Kathleen Latimer, tried separately, pleaded guilty to murder. She was sentenced to life in prison in February 2006. She is now 61 years old and will be eligible for parole in 2034. 2 people. Same crime. One on death row and recently executed, while the other will be eligible for parole after 28 years. Edward Lee Busby Jr. was sent to the Allen B. Polunsky unit in Livingston, Texas, death row, following his 2005 conviction. He would spend the next 21 years there. The central issue of his time on death row was not his guilt. That had never been in question. It was whether the state of Texas was constitutionally permitted to execute him at all. In 2002, the U.S. Supreme Court had ruled in Atkins v. Virginia that executing intellectually disabled people violates the Eighth Amendment's ban on cruel and unusual punishment. That ruling did not end the debate. It shifted it. Because the Supreme Court left it to each individual state to decide how to determine who qualified as intellectually disabled. And Texas, historically, had applied some of the narrowest standards in the country. Busby's IQ scores, tested repeatedly across his lifetime, consistently fell between 65 and 75. Multiple evaluations documented what clinicians described as substantial intellectual deficits and significant limitations in adaptive functioning, meaning his ability to manage the tasks of ordinary daily life. He had been in special education programs. He had never held a stable job. He had been functionally dependent on others for basic decision-making for most of his adult life. His first execution date was set for 2020. It was stayed due to the COVID-19 pandemic. A second date was set for February 2021. It was stayed again while courts reviewed his intellectual disability claim. Then, in the lead up to the May 14, 2026 execution date, something remarkable happened. The Tarrant County District Attorney's Office, the same office that had prosecuted Busby and put him on death row in the first place, commissioned its own independent expert to evaluate Busby's intellectual disability claim. That expert concluded that Busby met the full diagnostic criteria for intellectual disability and was ineligible for execution under the Eighth Amendment. The prosecution's own expert, not the defense's. The prosecution hired someone. That person evaluated Busby and came back and said, "This man should not be executed." Based on that finding, the Tarrant County District Attorney's Office formally recommended that Busby's sentence be reduced to life in prison. And then the trial judge looked at the findings of both independent experts and disagreed with them. Since 2017, 19 people in Texas have been removed from death row after courts recognize they are intellectually disabled and therefore ineligible for execution. These decisions reflect a necessary course correction toward compliance with constitutional standards. Yet Edward Lee Busby Jr. has been denied that same recognition and now faces execution, even though the experts in his case agree he meets the criteria for intellectual disability. On May 8, 2026, 6 days before the scheduled execution, a three-judge panel of the U.S. Court of Appeals for the Fifth Circuit granted a stay, pending further review. One of those judges, James Graves Jr., wrote in a concurring opinion, "The medical community's consensus here is that Busby is intellectually disabled and ineligible for execution." The Texas Attorney General's office immediately filed an emergency application to the U.S. Supreme Court to vacate that stay. At approximately 5 p.m. on May 14, 2026, 1 hour before the scheduled execution, the U.S. Supreme Court issued its ruling. By a majority vote, over the explicit objections of the court's 3 liberal justices, the stay was vacated. The execution could proceed. Busby's attorneys filed one final emergency stay request with the Fifth Circuit. It was denied within the hour. The Texas Board of Pardons and Paroles, which had voted on his clemency petition, had voted unanimously against recommending mercy, though notably, they only cast that vote after the Supreme Court had already cleared the execution to go forward. Busby spent his final hours at the Huntsville unit. His last meal was not reported. His sister was present, watching through a window and praying. By 6 p.m. on May 14, 2026, it was time. The execution took place at the Huntsville unit of the Texas Department of Criminal Justice on the evening of May 14, 2026. The method was a single drug lethal injection. When asked by the warden for his final statement, Edward Busby spoke at length. He was strapped to the gurney when he said it. He addressed the Crane family directly. He said, "Sir, ma'am, I am so sorry. I ask that you please don't hate me and that you can find it in your heart to forgive me for the part that I played in what happened to her. Ms. Crane was a lovely woman. I never meant anything bad to happen to her. I am so sorry. I am so sorry. But I feel asleep and I don't know what happened. Please forgive me, please, if not for me, for yourself. Because the Father said if we don't forgive those who wrong us, He will not forgive us. And I know that you are angry. I know you're angry and I'm sorry. I'm not happy about what happened. I've hurt your family. I've hurt my family. And I wish I could take it all back. With all my heart I wish I could take it back. My sister has to live without me now, to become a victim. I had no right to even get in that car. But I will take the blame. I will take the blame if it will help. I'm sorry. Please forgive me, please don't hate me. Please find it in your heart to forgive me, for I know Jesus loves you like He loves me. He loves us all. He wants us all to turn to Him, to surrender our lives. I surrendered my life to Him, my Father God. I have changed my life. I just ask that you please don't hate me. Please, sir, please forgive me. He then turned toward the window where his sister was watching and praying. Sis, I love you, man. Please surrender your life to God and change. Please find you a good church. Surrender your life to God and live for God. That is the only way. We don't have to follow the church, for Jesus said, "Follow me." Pick up your cross and follow Him like I did. I had at least 10 years of following God, and then a good 3 years of surrendering. I surrendered my life to God. But I'm here now because this is the will of God, and I'm going home to be with Jesus. I will see you on the other side. Glory be to God. All praises be to my Father God. I'm ready, Warden. Then the drugs began flowing. Busby took a sharp breath. He closed his eyes. He gasped. Then he began making snoring sounds, sounds that grew progressively quieter. Within 40 seconds, all movement and all sound ceased. Edward Lee Busby Jr. was pronounced dead at 8:11 p.m. on May 14, 2026. He was 53 years old. The time from the drugs beginning to his death was 38 minutes. He was the 600th person executed in Texas since the state resumed the death penalty in 1982. Florida, the country's second highest executing state, had carried out 131 executions in the same period. Texas had executed more people than the next 4 states combined. The Texas Capital Abolition Project, the Death Penalty Information Center, and multiple advocacy groups released statements condemning the execution, arguing that the state of Texas had executed a man who its own experts had determined was constitutionally ineligible for the death penalty. They called the trial judge's decision to override the unanimous expert findings a direct violation of the precedent the Supreme Court had spent 2 decades establishing. Whether this execution represents justice, and what kind of justice it is something I will have to hear from you in the comments below. If this story is one you feel deserves to be heard, share it. Leave your thoughts in the comments below. And subscribe for more stories told the way they deserve to be told. If you're a lover of creepy true crime stories, true crime documentaries, horror crime, unsolved mysteries and the rest, you can do well to check out our twin channel Mysterious Dark Files for more videos like that.